Welcome to our virtual monthly meeting on all things celiac. Today's webinar is Living with COVID-19 Celiac Disease, Autoimmunity, and Hyperinflammation, hosted by the National Celiac Association and the Celiac Research Program at Harvard Medical School. I'm Lee Graham, Executive Director of the National Celiac Association. Serving the gluten-free community since 1993, NCA provides educational resources on our website like Ask the Dietitian, Raising Our Celiac Kids, Supporting Celiac Centers, and Zoom support meetings are open to all on the second Tuesday of the month. And my deepest thanks to all of those who have donated to our food insecurity initiative, Feeding Gluten-Free. Together, we have given over $1 million worth of gluten-free food to food pantries throughout the country. Thank you so much. For today, you're welcome to ask general questions through the Q&A feature, which is located on the bottom right corner of your Zoom screen. If you're still struggling to connect with us, tech support is available if needed at digitalmedia@partners.org, or you can call 857-282-6470. Also, this session is being recorded and will be available for viewing on NCA's website, nationalceliac.org. I'm honored to introduce our moderator today, Dr. Dan Leffler. Excuse me, Dr. Leffler is a practicing gastroenterologist caring for patients with gluten-related disorders, including celiac disease and other gastrointestinal disorders. He is founding member of the Celiac Center at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. He has received multiple grants from National Institutes of Health, numerous foundations, and industry members supporting his research to advance digestive health. Dr. Leffler has authored or co-authored more than 150 articles in peer-reviewed literature and co-authored a patient-focused book with Melinda Dennis titled Real Life with Celiac Disease, Troubleshooting and Thriving Gluten-Free. He joined Takeda Pharmaceuticals in 2016, where he is Senior Medical Director and Global Clinical Leader for Celiac Disease in the gastrointestinal therapeutic area. Welcome, Dr. Leffler.
Thank you so much, Lee. Pleasure to be here. And thank you to the National Celiac Association as a whole for supporting this effort to provide such great educational resources to our community. I think this is going to be really a fantastic webinar. So as you're aware, the topic for today is living with COVID-19, celiac disease, autoimmunity, and hyperinflammation. Clearly something that's top on everyone's mind right now. And I also am looking forward to hearing what our experts have to say. Just a note that there are continuing education units available for this now for registered dietitians, nurses, physicians, and social workers. So this is a great benefit to everyone participating. You have to participate for the entire session to be able to claim credit, and certificates will be emailed to you within 30 days following the event. So information will be coming if you are interested in these continuing education units. Just one final note about the Q&A. This is available below. I see some questions coming in, which is wonderful. Please do try to keep these to general questions of interest to the overall community, things that are very specific to yourself, probably better to address with your own clinical team. So with no further ado, let's get started. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who really needs very little introduction. Alessio Fasano, someone who's been in the celiac community for all of the modern era, I think. So Alessio is a world-renowned pediatric gastroenterologist, research scientist, and entrepreneur. He directs the Celiac Research Center for Celiac Center for Research and Treatment at Mass General Hospital for Children, where he is also the division chief of pediatric gastroenterology and nutrition, and the director of the Mucosal Immunology and Biology Research Center, again at MGH for Children. He's a professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and a professor of nutrition at the Harvard School of Public Health. Alessio has authored a number of books, including Gluten Freedom, a book for general readers about celiac disease, gluten-related disorders, and the gluten-free diet, and has most recently co-authored Gut Feelings, the Microbiome in Our Health, which was published just last year. So welcome, Alessio, and excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you, Dan, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. Let me share my screen and the usual sentence to my moderator. Can you see it? I'm assuming yes, right?
Yes, looking good and sounding good.
Good. Okay. So, so today I've been asked to cover a work in progress. That what is the impact of COVID-19 in celiac patients, in particular, and people that suffer chronic inflammatory diseases in general. These are my disclosure. It's a long list. Mostly they are associated to my role of a member scientific advisory board, a variety of companies that are working in the domain of microbiome. Some of the concepts that we're going to discuss will be touched upon with some of my related activities here, and I will point out which one are those. Just to give an historical perspective, again, as I was telling you, with this COVID-19, it's been such a steep learning curve. I will go through what we learned in the past 2 years, the premise that we start, and the results and the conclusion that we reached during this, horrible, experience that we had to go through. First of all, it should not come as a surprise. Coronavirus has been, object of interest and discussion for a long, long time, because it's not that just COVID-19 led for the first time our encounter with coronavirus. In the past, we had, experience with coronavirus with low pathogenicity. So, in other words, viruses that give, mild symptoms, and you see the list there. And it was reported equally in adults and kids. And then, there were a series of high pathogenicity coronaviruses that cause severe lower respiratory symptoms that historically have been reported to be rare in kids, less than 2%, including SARS-CoV-2. This was the impression at the very beginning of the pandemic, when we start to see this flood of people coming in the hospital that need to be on respirator because they had involvement of the lower airways, and we didn't see any kids with that kind of pathology. And that led to what we already, again, knew in part for other coronavirus, experiences, that applies also to this new SARS-CoV-2 virus that caused this pandemic. The first phase is common to everybody, adults and kids alike. The virus port of entry is the upper airways, where it caused little or no symptoms. They came to the attention to, the clinical community, because when it goes to the second phase, in which, the virus makes its journey in the lungs, that translates in severe symptoms of shortened breath, inflammation in the systemic circulation, the cytokine storm that eventually leads to the multi-inflammatory state that we, at the beginning, saw probably mostly, if not exclusively, in the old people that were the most susceptible and unfortunately paid the highest price in terms of mortality. This virus, just again, I don't want to go in this technicality, just to make the point of the rationale to build the vaccine that we were blessed to have in a very short period of time. In order to, replicate, so in other words, do this virus cycle, needs to get into a target cells, in this case, the epithelial cells of the airways, that they need to hijack to get some of the machinery within the cell to, replicate and spread. And they do this through a specific receptor. And the binding this receptor is due to this protein that is called spike, the ones that have been used to engineer the messenger RNA vaccines, particularly the Pfizer and Moderna. That has been the first one that have been, deployed. And that's given the rationale why, scientists went after this protein. Now, what was clear from the very beginning and took precedent in the entire ordeal is that, among the very organs that, the SARS-CoV-2 target, the GI tract seems to be exquisitely, privileged in terms of the inflammatory process. At the beginning, 1/3 of patients with COVID-19 infection experienced gastrointestinal symptoms. We didn't understand at the beginning why, given that this is an airway kind of disease. The vast majority there had symptoms that were mild, like loss of appetite, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. So in other words, nothing really specific. They're very common gastrointestinal symptoms. If they develop symptoms in the GI tract, were never the first symptoms that they presented, nor they have the exclusively symptoms that they, had experience with. And in general, were short-lived. So these folks, they have, these symptoms that will go away relatively quick. Then at that point, two key questions were put on the table, specifically by the NIH, but also by patients that come to our clinic, that really engaged us in trying to really have a better understanding of what is the consequence of this pandemic in people that suffer celiac disease. The first question being, if I have celiac disease, am I at higher risk to be infected with the virus? So in other words, am I more susceptible to get the COVID-19? But more importantly, particularly this stage of the pandemic in which we start to look at the consequences to be infected, there is a second question that's been raised. So in other words, if I'm infected with COVID-19, do I increase my risk to develop an autoimmune disease if I'm genetically predisposed? For the first question, there have been several studies that I will briefly review here, in which pretty much, there have been some, what we call systemic review, in which, patients with autoimmune diseases were compared to patients that did not have autoimmune diseases, that they got both infected. And long story short is that at least in this specific cohort in the north of Italy, the number of people that will eventually get positive and will be hospitalized in terms of percentage were equivalent. So there was not increased risk. So that was one study. And then this is another study that was published, early in the pandemic. That it looks in a slightly different way to see if there was any chance, if I have an autoimmune disease, to increase my risk to be infected. And once again, the bottom line of the results is the answer is no. So concerning this first part of the story, if I have celiac disease, am I more susceptible to be infected with COVID-19 virus? The answer is no. And there have been other studies later on that confirm that that's the case. When we did a quick survey at the beginning of the pandemics, both in the United States and Italy, we fundamentally found that, there were no increased, susceptibility, for example, in people with refractory celiac disease. But when it comes to people with the COVID-19 testing was pretty much, what was reported at that time in the general population. Of course, now the attack rate is much, much higher because of the new variants that the Omicron, its infective rate much, much higher. Out of this, there are many questions that were posed. Some have been addressed, some maybe not. So the first one, again, the rationale why people were concerned about, the susceptibility to be infected is because a good proportion of people with celiac disease have what we call a low function of the spleen, that we know being extremely important to protect us against infections and for several mechanisms. And again, this has been, I believe, settled and say, even if you have hypersplenism, the chance that you are more susceptible to contract, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, it's like the general population. So the other question was, if I have a systemic autoimmune disease like celiac disease, can I? What are my behavior and strategies that I can use to minimize the risk to contracting the COVID-19? And the answer is very little, given the fact that the chance to contract is more related to the behavior that applies to everybody. Using the mask, the physical distance, washing hands, and then, being vaccinated. That by far, it's the most impactful. measure that has been efficient to prevent the infection. Otherwise, the rest is depending on what kind of variant we're dealing with. Now with the new variants, again, the dependence is so high that now we have an attack rate that's coming up again, at least in Europe, but soon it's going to happen here as well. So, and again, this now is another question that's been settled. Should I be vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccines? And if so, which one? The messenger RNA, the attenuated vaccine, what is the risk-benefit ratio of the vaccination? I believe the numbers are so overwhelmingly clear now that, anybody, including and most importantly, the people who are most susceptible, should be vaccinated. So vaccinated means all three, doses, because otherwise, if you just do 2 doses, it's pretty much like not to be vaccinated. And even with 3 doses, we know now that the titer of the antibodies remains high for the 6-7 months after the last vaccination. Should I get the flu vaccine? Absolutely yes, because that doesn't really influence if you have, you are in a condition to be recommended flu vaccine. One does not exclude the other. Other questions that were specifically in pediatrics has been settled as well. We now know that SARS-CoV-2 infection is not rare at all in kids, the same frequency in adults. The reality that the kids get less sick in terms of morbidity compared to adults, definitely even for mortality, with a very few exceptions that we will discuss in a moment. Do they have some specific tools to be less susceptible to have severe, consequences, particularly in the lower highways? And the answer is maybe. So we don't know for sure, but maybe that there are some issues that seem to protect them against the severe consequences of infection, but definitely not to protect them against infection, because as I said before, it's the same in adults. It's safe to send my child to school without mask, since she's more at risk being affected by celiac disease. As you know, now the policies are changing, and the kids now are allowed to go to school without masks. And the answer is, coming to infections, particularly, with these new variants, the risk to contract COVID-19 is higher if you don't wear the mask, but not because you're celiac. Anybody is the same story. What I should do if my child has not been vaccinated, because let's say it's in the age range that the vaccine has been proven not to be effective, or for whatever reason not been vaccinated yet. Once again, the other measure, including the mask, washing hands, the physical distance, is the only thing that can protect your child to be infected. Now, let's come to the bottom and the core of the discussion, the flip of the coin. Can COVID-19 infection trigger a set of autoimmunity? Unfortunately, we learned that that's the case. There've been at the beginning a series of evidence that were, initially anecdotic, and then became more and more robust. And, for the purpose of the discussion, and because the time that, it's still available, I'm going to, focus mainly on celiac disease and the most severe consequence of infection in kids, that is called the multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, or MIS-C. How COVID-19 infection can trigger the autoimmune process. This is not different from mechanisms that have been hypothesized for years now, how viruses can cause a trigger autoimmunity, because this is one of the key elements that have been put out there. And there have been, several studies suggesting that an infection, particularly viral infection, can trigger on a specific genetic background the autoimmune process. There are several theories, but the one that I want to really focus on, because we have robust evidence coming to SARS-CoV-2, is the production by the virus of a specific molecule that we call super antigens. They are specifically, exclusively capable to make the immune system to attack its own body, and therefore develop the autoimmune process. This is a study that was relatively recently, a few months ago, published in a surveillance of the pediatric celiac disease prevalence during the pandemic, compared to previous to the pandemic. So without, again, going too much in detail of the study, what they did was comparing the number of diagnosed celiac disease using as denominator the number of endoscopies, that is the way that you make the diagnosis based on histopathology, in a pre-pandemic era and during the pandemic. And you see, the red bar, the prevalence that is, calculated per endoscopy is done. They is, in the pre-pandemic era varies between 1.7 and 3.2, and then, just jump up during the pandemic to 10%. So bottom line, what they concluded, and based also the fact that this 10% of kids that end up to be diagnosed with celiac disease have evidence to be exposed to COVID-19 or having diagnosed with COVID-19 or been in contact with somebody that was infected with COVID-19, they made the conclusion that this jump was indeed due to exposure to COVID-19 that, increased by almost, threefold the chance to develop celiac disease during the pandemic era. The other one that is also an autoimmune disease, has been defined as such, is the most severe complication of COVID-19 infection in kids. The morbidity and mortality is extremely high in these kids. This is a multi-organ failure due to this inflammation that occurs in several districts of the body, including the heart, the brain, and the kidney, and the GI tract. Occurs weeks, if not months after the initial infection, that can, again, be little or no symptoms. What is characterizing here, compared to 30% of people with GI symptoms with COVID-19 infection, that almost the totality of these kids that develop MIS-C, they have GI symptoms, almost 98%. They have fever, a percentage of them have cardiac complication, that is the worst case scenario. And the only treatment that we had available until the recent past was to mitigate the cytokine storm using steroids and IV immunoglobulins, and occasionally, the rebound of symptoms. We didn't know what caused MIS-C. And again, to make a long story short, number one, there was an evidence that now has been validated by many others that the spike protein is a superantigen. So this same spike protein that, is necessary for the virus to gain access to the cells, the same that's been used as a target for the vaccine, is capable, if gain access somehow in the bloodstream, to act as a superantigen, instigating specific immune cells that we call T cells to expand and generate a lineage of cells that can eventually go after your own body. So that's pretty much what we learned about the spike protein as a superantigen. The second thing that we learned was that, after the initial port of entry in the airways, the SARS-CoV-2 find this biological niche in the GI tract. Both in adults and kids, the SARS-CoV-2 can sit there for weeks and months. And this has been proved specifically in MIS-C, where the vast majority of these kids, they have the virus there while they are admitted in the hospital with this complication. And interestingly enough, if you look into their bloodstream, there is no virus there whatsoever. But there is a large amount of the spike protein, the superantigen, compared to healthy control, but also compared to COVID-19 kids infected with COVID-19, but they did not develop the MIS-C. And definitely this applies to S1. There is another permutation of the spike protein, but not other components of the virus, like the nucleocapsid that was equally low in the three places there. Because MIS-C is very similar, clinically speaking, to another condition that's typical of childhood that's called Kawasaki disease. And because 2-3 years ago, we found out that Kawasaki disease was related to an increase of a molecule that increased gut permeability that we call zonulin. And we were able to rescue this animal model of Kawasaki by giving this zonulin inhibitor that is the larazodide, now in phase 3 trial in celiac disease. Dr. Leffler has been, one that's been studying this molecule the most. And because of the clinical similarity, we end up to look into the blood concentration of zonulin in MIS-C, and we found indeed this zonulin, levels to be increased compared to healthy control, and they were comparable to the kids with Kawasaki disease. We developed a theory that though the steps that brings these kids to this severe complication are the following: infection of the airways, little no symptoms, the virus got in the GI tract, cause an imbalance in the ecosystem, or what we call the dysbiosis, that in turn leads to release of zonulin that increase gut permeability to molecules that from the gut lumen can go into the bloodstream, including the spike protein that goes up. And therefore, that, based on a specific genetic background, will lead to the cytokine storm that is typical of MIS-C. And if this was correct, using the same inhibitor of the zonulin molecule that's called larazodide that we use for celiac disease in this case should have fixed the problem. We eventually got the approval for compassionate use from the Food and Drug Administration to use indeed the larazodide in these kids. And sure enough, in the first kids that we studied, we saw an immediate abatement of the spike protein in the bloodstream and a sudden improvement of the symptoms and the number of hospitalization. So this is the theory that is behind, the use of larazodide, the rationale. I explained the steps that are involved, and this is what we end up to publish, as a consequence of this, that, SARS-CoV-2 is in the stool, zonulin is released, the inflammation is triggered by this spike coming in the bloodstream. And rather to just go after the consequence of the inflammation, use anti-inflammatory drug like steroids and the immunoglobulins given by IV, we now are mechanistically targeting this antigen traffic with larazodide. We were able to have approval for either 4 kids for compassionate use. These are the characteristics of these kids. The symptoms that they experienced, as you see, all of them had GI symptoms. 3 of them were on the ward. 1 was an intensive care unit, and all of them, they received the larazodide, eventually improved the symptom much faster than compared to the kids that were not treated. And specifically, the clearance of spike occurred within 24 hours in the ones that were treated compared to 10 days, the one that were not treated. And the GI symptoms improved, quickly. So these are the data that I was telling you. So that they could compare to 6.7 days of GI symptoms. The resolution, the symptoms for this one that were treated was 2.3 days. And again, the clearance of spike happened in 1 day average compared to 10 days, the one that were not treated. So what are the next step here? That, again, the SARS-CoV-2, even if now is given less mortality, is still an issue that we need to be aware of. The new variants, they have, this, extreme high virulence, and therefore the spreading is much more efficient. And the consequence, what we call long COVID, worst case scenario being MIS-C, will remain a concern and can be life-threatening, both in our kids and adults, because there is a MIS-A, that is the adult counterpart. We were able to obtain the permission by the Food and Drug Administration based on this open label studies to do a phase 2 double-blind randomized clinical trial to test the safety and efficacy of larazodide in MIS-C. By the way, larazodide was never tested in pediatrics before, and so far it has the same safety profile that we see in adults, very robust. 7 kids are being already recruited in this phase 2 double-blind. And, the target is 20 kids, and we'll see if indeed what we saw in open label will, be replicated with this double blind. And of course, the goal is to minimize morbidity and mortality of MIS-C. I'm going to finish by saying this has been an unbelievable journey. If somebody 3 years ago would have told me that we were going to, this, incredible experience that we had with the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, I will not have anticipated that. Every hospital in town, but in the nation, has been repurposed to take care of, to stop everything else and take care of this pandemic. And thanks to this, we've made a lot of advances in our understanding of possible diagnostic treatment targets. This is the front, entrance of our lab. Soon after that, we started this biobank for kids, and we started this project with Larazza and so on and so forth. These all thank you notes that we got from kids that eventually, were involved in these studies. And again, we've been very pleased to see this progressing. And I think that, again, lesson learned. If you redeploy and repurpose what you're doing, in this case, working on the treatment of celiac disease for other situation like this can really have, incredible consequences. And nevertheless, to say that, all this would not have been possible without a multitude of individuals that stopped doing what they were doing and came to rescue for this situation. So that's pretty much what I have to say.
Thank you, Dr. Fuzano. Fascinating as always, and really amazing progress in such a short period of time. I think this is really, one of the silver linings of this whole pandemic is showing what we can really do when we are focused and have the resources. So moving on, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, and of course, Dr. Fuzano will be back for the Q&A at the end. Dr. Steve Plogsted. Dr. Plogsted has been involved in the field of gluten medications since 1995, and actually I feel like I owe you a personal debt because no one left my clinic for many years without being referred to your website, glutenfreedrugs.com, which has been a wonderful resource for as long as I've been working in this field. He's written numerous articles and book chapters on the subject, as well as given presentations locally, regionally, and nationally. He received both his bachelor's and doctoral degree from the University of Cincinnati College of Pharmacy. He is currently retired from pharmacy practice. However, fortunately for all of us, he maintains a close relationship with the American Society of Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition, where he was honored as a fellow. He is board certified nutrition support pharmacist. And Dr. Plogsted, we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Let's see if my technical knowledge here.
All right, it's looking good. If you want to
There you go. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, coming through great.
Okay, well, Dan, why don't you go ahead and display the polling question. So which of the following starches could possibly be responsible for a gluten reaction when taking a prescription medication in people with celiac disease? You got 4 choices there. And while you're mulling over the answer, just want to let you know I have no conflicts of interest, so there's no issues there. And before we get started, just something while we're waiting for you to answer is in the pharmaceutical industry, if you see an ingredient in package insert or list that says starch, in the food industry, we know that it should be corn. In the pharmaceutical industry, it could be any starch. So don't get fooled at thinking it's just cornstarch in there. And another thing to keep in mind, whether you're discussing it with your physician or other dietitians or drug companies, there's no such thing as gluten-free in medications. We all say it, and the reason there's no definition of gluten-free in the pharmaceutical industry. If they refer to a product being gluten-free, or you hear somebody saying gluten-free, and it's been tested, they tested to less than 20 parts per million, just like they did in food. However, again, there's no real official gluten-free definition in the pharmaceutical industry. So where's the potential sources of gluten in medications? Well, we've got the tablet, capsule, or shell, an active ingredient in there, and it's rare. In fact, I don't know for sure that I've ever heard there's an active ingredient that has gluten molecules in it, but I did have a drug company one day told me that the active ingredient did, and as I did further research, they were wrong. Most of the excipients the starches are corn, potato, tapioca, or wheat. But there's no barley or any rye in any pharmaceutical or any prescription pharmaceutical medication. So the answer to the polling question would be 2, wheat. Now, here's a list of a lot of the, excipients in pharmaceutical manufacturing. Now, I had an article I read a number of years ago that a company or a group of people looked at over 4,000 package inserts. Out of that 4,000 package inserts, 1/3 of them had the word starch in it. Of the 1/3 of the products that had starch, 75%, well, 74% were actually cornstarch. About 24% were potato. 0.22% had the word wheat in it. And they didn't talk about tapioca. I did find one years ago that had tapioca, but those are the main starch ingredients. So basically, we're going to talk about some of the drug therapy classes for COVID-19, and I'm going to give you some of the drugs that are available and what we can expect to have as far as an excipient base. Now, as far as antivirals, this particular medication is used for people with weakened immune systems and individuals who had severe reactions. Oops, oh my goodness gracious. We looked at this 1,000 times and we got COVID-19 misspelling. This is injection only. And so to let you know, there are no gluten-containing molecules in an injectable. And as we know, if you're going to get a gluten reaction, you have to take it orally. But I do get a lot of people who are concerned about injections, but there's never, ever an issue with any injection containing any kind of starch. This particular drug is the only FDA approved drug to treat individuals with COVID-19, but it's only approved for patients at this time. These are the approvals of patients over the age of 12. It's restricted for use in hospitalized patients who need extra support because due to a high risk of serious illness. So it's not, at this point, it's not supposed to be given for everybody, but we know how things get battled in a hospital situation. Again, this is injectable only, so there's no issue with any gluten. The current FDA authorized one for emergency use is this Paxlovid. It's only an oral combination, and it's used to treat mild to moderate disease in those patients over 12 years of age, again, who face the threat of serious illness. And as you look at the ingredients here, you can see, if you look at, you can see there's actually nothing that comes from a gluten-containing source. The nice thing is, and it's hard to really get people to understand, the chance of gluten contamination from an oral medication in the pharmaceutical industry, it's at its highest when there's a starch involved. Now, the FDA even came out and looked at all the ingredients and pretty much stated the same thing. Unless it says a starch, the chances of gluten contamination are extremely low. If you look at the second part of this particular medication, you'll see I have a couple of things highlighted. And the reason I highlighted these, the sorbitan and polysorbate 80, those are made from starches, way back in their manufacturing process. And the starches they used, yes, it could have been wheat. However, it's been purified so completely, there's nothing left in the molecule that would give you a gluten reaction. It's just not there. All the celiac organizations I talk to on their websites will tell you that sorbitan and polysorbate 80, which are in a lot of other things, are really not a concern for somebody who has celiac disease or gluten intolerance. This next one here is another one for FDA is authorized for emergency use only. Again, is only indicated for adults at the higher risk and can't take other treatments. And you can see here, there's not anything in here that would be considered possible contamination in gluten. I know there's questions on alcohol, but the alcohols that are used in pharmaceutical preparations all are from corn grain. However, they're made distilled, so there's no products left in it, so it's pure alcohol. So there's no issues again of worrying about what kind of alcohol that you might encounter in one of these medications. Here are some monoclonals that are available. There's several of them here. These here, I'm showing you just as a general, they're for serious illness. They're all administered by infusion again, so we don't have any issue of gluten contamination in this one, and they can't be given orally. The combination here of these two products are not effective against the Omicron variant, which is just wonderful since that seems to be the most popular. The same thing with this particular combination drug. It's not effective against Omicron. At least at this point, we don't believe it is. This one here again is another oral formulation for people with COVID-19 who are on a ventilator or need supplemental oxygen. And if you look at the highlighted again, I got Mannitol, and here's the one that probably I get the most blowback, negative comments, et cetera, and I have the hardest fight with drug companies is Mannitol. Mannitol is just like the other sugar alcohols. Yes, it could have come from wheat. And this particular product, when you call a drug company, you're asking them, and this is not this product, but this is any other product you find that has mannitol in it. They may tell you that, oh, yes, it has mannitol. I'm sorry, that it has gluten in it. And if you ask them to specifically tell you what is the ingredient that contains gluten, if it's got mannitol in there, they will tell you mannitol. If it's another drug, liquid, you might get one of the other sugar alcohols. So be familiar with those sugar alcohols or polyols. And if the company tells you that is the source of gluten, just say thank you, and move on because they gave you wrong information again. Like I said, I fight with that. Advil came out with what they call it, a sugar-free Advil. And we called them, the first patient who called them said, yeah, it has gluten in it. And I called them and read them the riot act because they told me the mannitol, what was on the outer coating, was what made it contain gluten according to them. So it's a nightmare. I know it's a nightmare for you. I can get through these people, but it's, you get so much bad information. It drives me crazy. There are other drugs that are being used to treat COVID that have uncertain effectiveness. Here's a list of them here, and you might recognize a couple of these. This amlodipine is a very popular blood pressure medicine and shows you these ingredients. And this takes me an opportunity to talk to you about sodium starch glycolate. Sodium starch glycolate in the United States, probably about, I'm just making these numbers up from just my own research, but probably 95 or more percent is made from potato. The other 5%, give or take, comes from corn. Now, if you read any information on sodium starch glycolate, you'll be told that, yes, it can come from any starch source, including wheat. Well, again, maybe it can, but in the United States, I have never, ever seen, and neither did the FDA ever see a sodium starch glycolate that had anything but potato or corn. So you can be assured if that's what you see. An opportunity here to tell you that the package insert, which is the reference that your pharmacist may have, is not very complete as far as the source of some of these starches. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the website done by the NIH and the CDC, et cetera. It's called DailyMed. Now, they used to have a sister one called Pillbox, but they stopped supporting that. DailyMed will give you what kind of, 99% of the time, they will tell you what the source of the starch is. So you can go to that website. Actually, you could go to that without even talking to your pharmacist. All you need to know is the drug name, whether it's amlodipine or a brand name. And then if you happen to know the generic manufacturer, you can type in amlodipine, Dr. Reddy's, and then type in DailyMed, and that'll take you straight to the page that will show you all the ingredients. It's down toward the bottom of the page. You have to expand the page. It's down at the bottom of the page and tells you every strength and tells you all the ingredients and where they're derived from, if they know. Now, another blood pressure medicine called losartan. It's another one used for treat hypertension. It's in a drug class called sartans. Okay, this is the only drug that has been studied for the treatment of COVID-19. However, in that class of sartans is another drug it's called olmesartan, and there's been a lot of literature, a lot of print out there discussing olmesartan causing significant gluten-like symptoms in a number of patients, enough that they had to research it. Now, the other sartans have, to this point, have not shown to cause those gluten-like reactions. I just wanted to be aware, let you be aware of this in case for some reason either you are already taking olmesartan and you don't seem to be able to get rid of your symptoms, or somewhere along the line they discovered that olmesartan or the rest of the sartans are also good for COVID-19. And again, package insert or the daily meds shows that cornstarch, there is a starch in there, but it is cornstarch. That's the losartan. So again, no issues in people with celiac disease. Now the wonderful one, ivermectin. It's just gotten so much press, and it's, you know, it's used for human and animal parasitic treatments. Okay, the dose that they use for parasitic treatment is much less than what they used to, what they have been using to treat COVID symptoms, their COVID-19 infection. So these larger doses can cause serious harm, and the FDA has pretty much said, you know, you need to stay away from it. Although we know that when people are desperate, they know they're anti-vaxxers. They don't want to take a chance. They want other treatments. You know, ivermectin has been the one. Now, just on Friday, I saw a report that came out of the Wall Street Journal. Now, I don't have any investments. I don't read the Wall Street Journal, but it was a reference to something else. Is yet to show that double-blind study that yet to show that ivermectin reduces COVID hospitalizations any more than placebo. So just be aware of that. Again, I'm not trying to stop you from seeking that out if that's what you feel is necessary, but it hasn't been shown to work. Both the brand names and all the generics I could find all contain cornstarch, and that's the only one of starch in there. The other one that our previous president had really hawked, and before we got more information, was hydroxychloroquine. It's another anti-malarial drug used for emergency treatment of COVID-19, but you know, again, the studies have just not shown it to be effective. But, you know, again, if you do go that route, it does have the polysorbate starch, but neither one of these things it actually has cornstarch. And so there's no reason to worry if you do take hydroxychloroquine. Same thing with chloroquine. It's another anti-malarial. In its ingredients, it's pre-gelatinized starch in the package insert, but if you go to Daily Med, you'll see it comes from corn. The same thing, I'll tell you sodium starch glycolate, but it won't disclose that it comes from potato unless you go to some place like Daily Med. So there are some drug treatments in long COVID. So, you know, there are more and more data coming out on long COVID, and so there's not that many drugs out here being used, but we do have a couple. And one is this one that's used to treat major depressive disorders. That's an oral medication. It does contain mannitol, sodium starch glycolate. It would be interesting to call the company and ask them if it's gluten-free, just to see if they give you the, yeah, it's gluten-free, and then mannitol. I have not done that personally, so it's something I guess I could do just for fun. I just love to tear them apart when they don't know what they're talking about. We had one drug company, I had a very spirited discussion with them because they swore, and I'm not going to mention the company's name, but they make Advil. And they came out and said ours contained gluten. It's the liquid gel caps. They said theirs contained gluten. And we had a battle back and forth. I escalated through the drug information chain at their company, and I got some supervisory person. And when I went toe to toe with her, she admitted that, well, no, they don't check for gluten. They just had the mannitol in there, so they immediately told people that, or they had, maybe it was probably one of the sorbitan. They said, well, that's in there, and it could come from wheat, so that's why we're telling you it contains gluten. So if you see any discussions on the web pages or the chat lines or Facebook about that, they made that up. And so again, it's one more thing the consumer has to deal with, unfortunately. Another drug here, again, it's got some polyvinyl alcohol and silicone dioxide. And there's really nothing in this particular one. It comes in both a capsule and a tablet. It's interesting when I look at some of these, they will tell you that it contains pharmaceutical ink on the printing. And again, that's gluten-free. It's hard to find that information, but pharmaceutical ink is gluten-free. So now I was asked to talk a little bit about COVID-19 face masks, because, again, here you walk around that thing right by your mouth and you talk about close potential contamination. Here we go. It contains produced from petrochemical, inner layers or absorbent materials such as cotton, other fibers, and other non-woven fibers, polypropylene, and an outer level of non-absorbent materials such as polyester. So again, you putting these masks on does not expose you to potential gluten contamination. However, if things just can't get any worse for the celiac community, future COVID masks are trying to go green. They want things that are biodegradable. So what are they looking for? What are they studying? Studying masks that are made of wheat gluten biopolymers. So again, if you hadn't have enough to worry about, now you may have to have find your choice of masks and do some research. It's not out yet. It's being investigated. So as information comes out, we can publish more information on it. But as it is right now, they're looking at using wheat gluten, not just wheat starch, wheat gluten. So anyways, the COVID-19 or similar SARS-type viruses will probably be with us for many years. There are treatments that are evolving, and we're figuring out how to use them and how we're going to use them. People are desperate for cures to COVID-19, and unfortunately, we don't know. And the current drugs that we use to treat or prevent themselves are free of gluten contamination. But as you know, there are several ingredients in some of these medications. As a matter of fact, I should have told you this when they got to ivermectin. No, I'm sorry. Paxlovid. I put something on one of the celiac websites. Maybe it was a Twitter site. I don't remember. And I said, I investigated the use of Paxlovid, and I published all the information that you see here. And what I got back, some of the feedback, well, there's so many ingredients in there, I wouldn't take this anyway. Well, I didn't want to respond to the person because they were already upset. But if you look at most medications, as we saw, that the oral medications, whether it be liquid, tablet, capsules, or whatever, are likely to have the same amount of ingredients in there. So, and each one of those ingredients can affect people differently. And so if you have two different generic companies, they may not have the same ingredient as the other generic company, and you may not respond to it as well. That could be due to the excipients, their effect on your body, unrelated to gluten. And so before you, blame it on the medication, look up the ingredients and see if there's anything that can potentially contribute to your gluten symptoms. And again, you'll probably find out that it's not it's not the excipients, it's not gluten, it's just your sensitivity. Now, saying that too, there's only a certain level of that we can go down to assess for gluten in there, well below the 20 parts per million. And we do know, and I do appreciate the fact that people who are very sensitive to gluten, there may be traces of gluten in any product that contains a starch. It's just not measurable, and it's well below the 20 parts per million. And again, that's been verified by the FDA. The FDA did say that for the most part, you don't ever have to worry about an oral medication if you have celiac disease, especially unless you are really super sensitive. And then those products that contain a starch are most likely the potential cause. And there are some products that you might be able to use that don't have the starch in them that still will give you whatever drug you need. It's just you have to look to find that information. It's not readily available. And I can tell you, your pharmacist, God love them, they're not going to be able to help you. It's going to be a lot of legwork. That's where that daily med may come in handy for you. You just have to go through each and every product see if there's something that fits you, and then you can move on from there and ask your pharmacist if they'd be able to order it for you. So with that said, I appreciate your time and your attendance, and we can go to the questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Plogsted.
I got to unshare my, here, stop my.
Yeah, and Dr. Fasano, if you want to come back on screen.
There we go. Sorry, thank you.
There we go. Great. So thank you both. We are actually running a few minutes ahead of schedule for once, which gives us a little bit of extra time for questions, which is great because we have a lot of them. So why don't we start with one for Dr. Fasano? There were a number of questions that came in regarding risk factors for MIS-C, and especially genetic risk factors, or is there any way to know whether you or your child or somebody in your family might be at higher risk for this?
Yes, they are. Again, without going to clinicalities, the spike superantigen, in order to induce this T cells expansion and therefore the cytokine storm, needs to bind to its receptor. And a specific mutation of this receptor has been identified to make this binding with the spike protein more effective. And therefore, if you have that mutation, the variable region of this T cell receptor, you have an increased risk.
So is there anything, just to follow up, that sounds pretty technical though, there's nothing that someone would know from their own family?
No, unfortunately not.
To help them figure out, right?
Unfortunately not. The only thing that I can tell you is that there are, point of care tests that have been developed to check if you have spike in your blood with a drop of blood in 15 minutes, that if validated will be one way eventually, because if that doesn't happen, no matter if you have the genetic mutation or not, that should not be an issue. That will be less technical and cumbersome to check, more practical if feasible on the practical ground.
Thanks. All right, and we have a question for Dr. Plogsted. So an interesting question. So around why food companies seem like they're so ready to test end products for gluten exposure, but drug companies don't seem to be getting on board with this, and why might that be?
Well, it's almost, I won't say it's simple, it's the fact that they don't want to spend the money. And so when the FDA got involved, and there was a big push for the FDA to, make a statement on whether or not, we think that this should be disclosed on somehow, either in a package insert or whatever, or force them to test it. The problem lies in the fact that there are so few instances of any true potential gluten contamination. The numbers are so low, it doesn't justify the cost. Okay, so that's their big thing. Basically, it's not worth it to them to do that. I know there's been some legislation trying to force them to do that. Matter of fact, I was involved with the Senate. One of the bills that was presented to the Senate, which got shot down because there was just not enough interest. But the other issue is they would have to test each individual ingredient separately. And as you saw, you got 30 ingredients, or you would have to force their suppliers to test it. Because the FDA came out and said, basically, once you put it into a tablet or a capsule, there's no way to test it. There are so many ingredients in there. There's just no way to get the information you need on a finished product. So there is one drug company that actually tests every one of their products for gluten. A company called Perrigo, and they make a lot of generics, your Tylenols, your ibuprofens, all those things. They make a large selection, and they claim gluten-free. What happened was one of the celiac organizations just ripped them to shreds and said, well, there's no gluten-free definition in pharmaceuticals, but they did come out and say, we tested everything for 20 parts per million or less. But that's the only company I know that actually will test their medications. But that's kind of again, they responded to the public requests. But again, the other companies, the drug companies, it's just not worth their time.
Thank you. So question, maybe for Alessio, could be for anyone, about, we've talked a lot about the COVID infection triggering autoimmune diseases, including celiac disease. What about the vaccine? Is there any evidence that the vaccine can trigger autoimmunity? So
the data that we have right now suggests that the they are limited, by the way, because this is a work in progress and they are very descriptive, is that the incidence of celiac disease among people that are naturally infected seems to be higher than the people that have been vaccinated. I use the conditional because, this will require a systemic review of data to be shared in their details that we don't have yet. But, for what we read in the literature, and we also have done now, a observational, analysis of the incidence of celiac disease in our prospective cohort, that is this CDGEM cohort. And once again, it looks like that we see an acceleration during this pandemic of cases compared before pandemic. Here, where can be a little bit more mechanism to understand why. But, again, these are preliminary data. I'm not really, so convinced until we have more solid, analysis of the data. The vaccination in adults numbers are pretty solid to make the point that we didn't see any increased risk of celiac disease in somebody that has been vaccinated or any other immune disease, as a matter of fact. For kids, the number is not that solid.
Great, thanks. So back to drugs and gluten. A specific question about chewable vitamins for kids or other sort of more sort of flavored types of medications. Are those things that should be considered higher risk?
Oops, I'm just gonna put this back up here again. Actually, oops, I'm not back up here. Sorry. I don't know. Well, anyways, no, the flavors. I haven't found anything that would be considered an issue for children. I did fail to say something. When I'm talking about medications, I'm talking about those that are available in the U.S. market. I can't answer for the Canadian or the Mexican or whatever. Although, if you see a product, there's a lot of products that are imported from India. Those products are made to U.S. standards. They're not met to their standards. So anything that applies to a my information applies to any medication sold in the U.S. regardless of where it was manufactured. Now, with people going to Canada for some medications, I did find out that, for example, that there was an antibiotic, cephalexin, that the same manufacturer used corn in the United States and used wheat in Canada. Again, you have to understand that, we're only talking about American medications. So.
Great, thanks. And let me see, back to you, Alessio. A good question about whether how well controlled your celiac disease affects your risks for getting COVID, getting severe COVID, or complications of COVID.
So, and again, this is a broken record. I apologize if I'm repetitive. An individual with celiac disease that is on a gluten-free diet that is effective in controlling, the symptoms, the enteropathy, the autoimmune response with the TTG antibodies back to normal, is pretty much undistinguishable from a normal individual, healthy individual. Therefore, the risk is exactly the same. So if indeed, a matter of fact, I don't even know if we can call celiac disease at that point rather than celiac condition, that would become again a disease if you're exposing yourself to gluten voluntarily, accidentally, you put in motion your immune system. So long story short, that's the reason why I believe we have seen no increased risk of contracting COVID-19 if you have a well-controlled celiac condition.
Great, thanks. And so this probably speaks to the next question of, is there any particular vaccine or combination vaccine regimen that we recommend for people with celiac disease versus general population? You kind of spoke to this a little bit, but probably.
Not really. I mean, again, if you're well controlled, the messenger RNA or the attenuated vaccine, of a vaccine that's just, been circulating more recently, they should have the same level of safety that we see in the general population. So, a matter of fact, even people that they have less luck than people with celiac disease. Like they have chronic inflammatory disease, they have to be on anti-inflammatory drugs like biologics. There is even more recommendation to be vaccinated than the general population. So I would say definitely, I want to reassure everybody now, we're talking about millions and millions of people that have been vaccinated, that, you know, even if we took a chance at the beginning because we rushed through the process, these vaccines are very, very safe, and the cost-benefit ratio is definitely for vaccination.
Great, thank you. Steve, question about food allergens in general and medications. Are they the major food allergens even beyond wheat? Are these required to be reported in pharmaceuticals the way they are in foods? And if not, why not?
Why not? It's because it hasn't been mandated. And no, they aren't discussed at all. You just have to, the pharmacist has to know if they know the excipients, whether or not there's an issue. And I'll give you a good example. Before they started changing the inhalers over to what they have now, there was an inhaler for asthma that had peanuts in it. Wow. So isn't that a wonderful thing? If you got a peanut allergy, here you are taking peanuts. And as you, I don't know if you noticed on one of the, I think it was one slide, there was I believe it was one slide, there was a product that had soy. And again, people have soy allergens or allergies, and it doesn't need to be disclosed. Now, if you have a severe allergy to soy, that's an issue, or lactose. If you have an allergic reaction to lactose, that could be an issue, but it's not disclosed. If you just have a lactose intolerance, there's never going to be enough lactose in any oral medication to cause a lactose reaction, okay? That's only in foods. It's not going to happen in prescription medications. But again, if you have an allergy to lactose or an allergy to soy, there may be an issue. That's why I always have people, check their ingredients, because those are the things that nobody thinks of.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that peanut in an inhaler is scary. I was unaware of that.
Yeah, well, they got rid of it, and so it's like, what can you say? They just weren't thinking about it.
Yes. All right. So we have a lot of questions about long COVID, almost so many, I'm not sure where to begin, but I guess, maybe Alessio, like, what is the thinking about what is long COVID and how it interacts with autoimmunity?
The definition of long COVID is that, after you've been affected by the infection, either the symptoms, they don't go away, or they go away and they will come back and will stay there for weeks or months. Again, this is a work in progress. Nobody knows what it's related to, but, the most frequent are, the people that I was telling you before that, the sense of smell doesn't come back for months, that they develop chronic fatigue, they develop, respiratory symptoms like shortness of breath, even, months after that, the infection is resolved, or develop asthma if they're genetically predisposed to do that. They have cardiovascular problems. These are all the symptoms of the definition of long COVID. Even here, it seems that this presence of spike protein is the element that maintain that inflammatory status that will, create the problem. And again, what is the common denominator of all these organs? The endothelium. So in other words, the vessels that they serve this district with blood seems to be affected by specific changes that put them at risk for thrombosis, or in other words, clog of the blood in there, or other inflammatory process that will lead to this symptom. So if we would take control this inflammatory component, either with anti-inflammatory drugs, that's what we have right now, or now there's another trial on azodide, the long COVID. If this is the antigen trafficking maintain the inflammatory process, hopefully this will be mitigated. What really concerns me is that, the numbers are scary. We're talking about 20-40% of people with natural infection may eventually develop long COVID. And now with these new variants, they are so penetrant. Even if the initial hit, it's mild, or you have no symptoms whatsoever, you may end up with developing long COVID. It's something that we need to keep an eye on it.
Oops.
Thank you. And so is that, is there any evidence that long COVID is more common in people with celiac disease yet?
No, again, the numbers are very small, and there's been no systematic review that is needed to be done. But again, I would assume that if you're well controlled with your celiac, the numbers should not be higher. But I don't know the answer. Nobody's done a systemic review of the matter.
Great. And actually, just to follow on with that, we do have a number of questions about type 1 diabetes, which are very similar. Will people get type 1 diabetes at similar rates after getting COVID infection like we seem to see with celiac disease? And is type 1 diabetes a risk factor for long COVID or complications, even if well controlled?
Yeah, I mean, I see also a lot in the question answer that I'm trying to answer on real time as well. Mother Nature doesn't make stuff very complicated. So the machinery that puts you at risk for celiac disease are similar to type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, Hashimoto, and so on and so forth. But for reasons that we only partially understand, the comorbidity between celiac disease and some of these autoimmune diseases, particularly type 1 diabetes, is higher than expected in the general population. Now, if indeed one of the theories why we are put over the edge to develop an autoimmune process is an infection, a specific viral infection, then, and spike is that a super antigen has been proved that can use autoimmunity, then by definition, I'm assuming that, when you're infected with COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2 will be in your GI tract and the spike will get in your bloodstream, if you're genetically predisposed, you can, have an increased risk to develop either or both, depending on what is your genetic makeup. But this is pure speculation at this point, because we are building the airplane while we're flying here. So, while now we have a deep understanding of COVID-19 infection, we are still learning so much about the post-COVID infection, and including these complications like autoimmunity.
Great, thank you. So we might have time for one or two more questions. An interesting one just popped up. So for someone who has a risk factor for celiac disease, but doesn't actually have celiac disease, maybe they have another autoimmune disease or a family history, and they get COVID, would you recommend avoiding gluten for any length of time to reduce the risk of coming down with celiac disease?
I would not, but Dan, I would love to hear your opinion here, because I don't know. I don't know. I don't think so. But what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know either. I think if you look at the infant feeding studies, it's really hard to modify risk for developing celiac disease based on modifying how much gluten you take and when. And so I would guess you would have a lot of people avoiding gluten without really making much of a dent in actual risk. But, I think it's a really interesting question, and probably one that there's no right answer for.
That's right.
All right. Well, actually, it's about 2:15. So I actually think that this has been a wonderful session. So thank you again, Dr. Fasano, Dr. Plogsted. This has been a fantastic session. I know there's about 1,000 more questions. We could probably be doing this for the next 48 hours straight without getting to the bottom of everyone's questions. But hopefully this is a good start. Hopefully this has given everyone some additional information, some armament to make good decisions and we look forward to seeing everyone back at a future webinar. And with that, I'll pass it back to Lee. Thank you.
Thank you, doctors, for such insightful presentations. It was really wonderful. And our next April 14th webinar will be Aging Well with Celiac Disease. The link is up and registration is open at nationalceliac.org. Continuing education credits are available for dietitians, nurses, physicians, and social workers. Topics covered will be specific medical needs as we age, nutritional deficiencies and how to address them, and how to approach long-term care. Speakers will be Dr. Joe Murray from the Mayo Clinic and Katerina Molo, dietitian and director of education at National Celiac. Until then, from all of us here, see you next time and stay well.